In 1611, when the King James Bible was published, the translators made a single strategic choice in Genesis 6. One translation described divine beings descending from heaven, taking human wives, and producing a hybrid race of giants. That was too dangerous to let ordinary people read. The translators didn't delete the verses outright. That would have been too obvious. What they did was far more subtle. They translated a Hebrew word in a way that flattened its meaning completely. And when you understand what word they changed and why, the entire history of biblical interpretation shifts. These are 4 verses in Genesis chapter 6, a passage connected to the Book of Enoch, the fallen angels, and the Nephilim that caused more theological anxiety than almost any other passage in the entire Bible. Here's exactly what was hidden and why they wanted it hidden. Start with the text itself. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 2. In the original 1611, King James Version reads like this: "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Verse 4. "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown." 2 critical phrases in this passage need to be dissected. The first is sons of God. The second is giants. Both translation choices carry enormous implications for what Genesis 6 is actually describing. Take sons of God first. In Hebrew, the phrase is B'nai ha-Elohim, literally, sons of the God. And here's what's crucial. Every single time this exact phrase appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, it refers to supernatural beings, not humans, not righteous descendants of Seth, not kings or rulers, divine, heavenly beings. Job chapter 1 shows the B'nai ha-Elohim presenting themselves before Yahweh, with Satan among them. Job 38, verse 7, has the B'nai ha-Elohim shouting for joy at creation before any humans exist. Psalm 82 puts God standing in the divine council, judging among the Elohim. This is a consistent pattern throughout the text. The sons of God, in the Hebrew Bible's own usage, are members of God's heavenly court. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The King James translators in 1611 were working primarily from the Masoretic text, the standardized Hebrew text of the Old Testament. That Masoretic text is based almost entirely on the Leningrad Codex, which dates from 1008 AD. The Hebrew text behind your English Old Testament was copied in the year 1008, and the Masoretic tradition that shaped it was developed between the 6th and 10th centuries AD. But there's an older witness, a much older one. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, was composed in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ. That makes it over 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text as we have it. And in certain ancient copies of the Septuagint, Genesis 6, verse 2 doesn't say sons of God at all. It says something far more explicit. Codex Alexandrinus, one of the great unshown manuscripts of the Greek Bible from the 5th century, renders the phrase as the angels of God, not sons of God, angels of God. And Codex Vaticanus, another of the oldest and most important biblical manuscripts in existence, originally contained angels as well. Think about what that means. The oldest Greek translations of this passage, produced by Jewish scholars centuries before Christ, understood B'nai ha-Elohim to mean angels. They weren't being creative. They weren't adding to the text. They were translating what they believed the Hebrew meant, and they believed it meant angels descended from heaven and mated with human women. Now take that second critical word, giants. The Hebrew word in Genesis 6, verse 4 is Nephilim. The King James translators rendered it as giants, which seems reasonable on its face. The Septuagint had already translated Nephilim as gigantes back in the 3rd century BC, and the Latin Vulgate followed suit in the 4th and 5th centuries. So giants has a long pedigree as a translation. But here's the problem. The Hebrew word Nephilim comes from the root naphal, which means to fall. Nephilim doesn't mean giants. It means the fallen ones, or possibly those who cause others to fall. The word carries connotations of descent, of degradation, of beings who came down from somewhere they were supposed to stay. The Jewish Publication Society's translation doesn't even try to render the word into English. It simply keeps it as Nephilim because the term is so theologically charged that any English equivalent inevitably loses something. By choosing giants, the KJV translators gave you a picture of really tall people. By preserving Nephilim, you get something else entirely, the offspring of a cosmic transgression, hybrid beings that were never supposed to exist. This word appears only one other time in the entire Hebrew Bible, Numbers 13, verse 33. When Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan, they return with a terrifying report. "We saw the Nephilim there," they say. "The descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." That's the only other biblical reference to Nephilim by name, placing them in Canaan, which raises deeply uncomfortable questions that the text never fully resolves. So where does the truly terrifying part come in? For that, you need to look at a text that was never included in any version of the King James Bible, but which carried enormous influence in the ancient world and survives in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch. First, Enoch is an ancient Jewish apocalyptic text, attributed by tradition to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, the man who Genesis tells us walked with God and was no more, for God took him. The book was likely composed between 200 and 100 BC. The authors of the New Testament knew it well. Jude quotes it directly in his epistle. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the Beta Israel Jewish community of Ethiopia considered it scripture, and fragments turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls, including 4Q 201, 4Q 202, and 4Q 204, confirming it was circulating in Jewish communities well before the time of Jesus. Another Qumran text, the Book of Giants, picks up the Enochic narrative and develops it further, describing the Nephilim's violence and their disturbing dreams of impending judgment. The Genesis Apocryphon, also from Qumran, retells the Genesis 6 story from Noah's perspective, demonstrating just how central this tradition was to Second Temple Jewish thought. The Dead Sea Scrolls community wasn't treating Genesis 6 as a footnote, they were consumed by it. What does the Book of Enoch say about Genesis 6? It doesn't just expand the story, it detonates it. Where Genesis gives you 4 cryptic verses, Enoch gives you chapters. In the section known as the Book of the Watchers, chapters 6 through 9, we learn that God originally assigned a group of angelic beings called Watchers to observe and guard humanity. They were celestial sentinels, stationed to watch over the human race from their heavenly post. They were never supposed to intervene directly, but they did. A ringleader named Samyaza rose among the Watchers and proposed a plan. They would descend to earth and take human wives. Samyaza was afraid his fellow angels would abandon the scheme, leaving him alone to bear the punishment for a great sin. So he demanded a pact. All 200 Watchers, every leader of the angelic order, swore a binding oath together on Mount Hermon. And then they descended. They took human women as wives. They fathered children, the Nephilim, who grew into giants of enormous appetite and violence. These giants consumed everything humans produced, and when the food ran out, they turned on the humans themselves. They devoured people. They drank blood. The earth filled with violence and corruption on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. But that's not all the Watchers brought with them. They also transferred forbidden knowledge to humanity. An angel named Azazel taught humans how to forge weapons of war, swords, knives, shields, breastplates. He taught them metallurgy. Another taught enchantments and the cutting of roots, what we might call sorcery and pharmacology. Others taught astrology, the signs of the earth, the signs of the sun and moon. According to Enoch, humanity's rapid corruption wasn't just about sexual transgression. It was about the premature transfer of heavenly knowledge to a species that wasn't ready for it. That's the backstory Genesis 6 compresses into 4 verses. 4 verses that most modern readers skim past on their way to the flood narrative, never realizing that ancient readers would have recognized them immediately as a summary of one of the most catastrophic events in cosmic history. And here's where the real controversy begins. Because the angelic interpretation, the supernatural reading of Genesis 6, is actually the oldest interpretation on record. All of the earliest sources read the passage this way. From the 3rd century BC onward, the angelic interpretation appears in the Enochic literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Genesis Apocryphon, the Damascus document, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of Reuben, 2nd, Baruch, the writings of Josephus, and the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament itself. Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD in his Antiquities of the Jews, is remarkably direct. He states that many angels of God accompanied with women and begat sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that was good. He treats it as historical fact, not allegory. The early church fathers, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, Commodianus, all understood the sons of God as fallen angels. Origen, in Against Celsus, engaged the tradition extensively, and took it seriously as a framework for understanding cosmic evil. So, when did the interpretation change, and why? The shift began in earnest with Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. Augustine promoted what's now called the Sethite interpretation, the idea that the sons of God were simply the righteous descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men were the corrupt descendants of Cain. This reading had the advantage of avoiding the theologically uncomfortable idea that angels could physically interact with humans, produce offspring, or transgress in such a dramatic way. Augustine drew on the chronographiae of Julius Africanus and developed the view in his monumental work, City of God. John Chrysostom and later John Calvin followed in this tradition. Over the centuries, the Sethite view became the dominant interpretation in Western Christianity. The angelic reading didn't disappear, but it was pushed to the margins, treated as fringe, even embarrassing. A similar suppression played out in Judaism. Around 95 AD, Rabbi Akiva commissioned a man named Aquila to produce a new Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, one that would compete with the Septuagint, which Christians had adopted. And in rabbinic tradition, Shimon bar Yochai went so far as to pronounce a curse on anyone who translated B'nai Ha-Elohim in the angelic sense. Later authorities like Rashi and Nachmanides followed suit. Orthodox Judaism to this day generally rejects the angelic interpretation. And this brings us to another textual alteration that most people never hear about. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text behind the KJV, reads that the Most High divided the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. But the Septuagint reads, according to the number of the sons of God. Or, in some manuscripts, the angels of God. A Hebrew fragment from Qumran from the Dead Sea Scrolls confirms the older reading. The Masoretic scribes changed sons of God to sons of Israel, softening a passage that originally described God allotting nations to members of his divine council. This is a pattern, and it matters. The late biblical scholar Michael Heiser spent much of his career documenting exactly these patterns. Heiser earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages, and he argued that the Bible presents what he called a divine council worldview, a framework in which Yahweh, the supreme and uncreated God, rules over a council of created spiritual beings. These beings are the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. They're real, personal, and powerful, but finite and subordinate. And Genesis 6, in Heiser's reading, describes a subset of these beings who catastrophically violated the boundary between heaven and earth. Heiser's signature line was, "If it's weird, it's important." He argued that modern Christians have systematically flattened the Bible's supernatural worldview, domesticating passages that ancient readers would have found electrifying and terrifying. Genesis 6 stood near the very center of his project. His books, The Unseen Realm, Reversing Herman, and Demons became bestsellers, and his Naked Bible podcast reached hundreds of thousands of listeners who had never encountered these ideas in a seminary context. So, pull all of this together. The 1611 King James Bible didn't delete a line from Genesis 6, but what happened is, in some ways, more significant than a simple deletion. Over centuries, a combination of translation choices, manuscript traditions, and theological preferences gradually obscured what the oldest versions of this text actually say. The Septuagint's angels of God became sons of God. The Hebrew Nephilim, the fallen ones, became giants. The Book of Enoch, which provided the full narrative context for these 4 cryptic verses, was excluded from the biblical canon entirely. And the Apocrypha, which had been part of the KJV for 274 years, was stripped out in 1885. The result is that most English-speaking Bible readers encounter Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, as a strange, isolated fragment, a few confusing verses that seem to come out of nowhere and go nowhere. They read sons of God and think of righteous humans. They read giants and picture tall people. They have no framework for understanding what ancient Jewish and early Christian readers grasped immediately, that this passage describes a rupture in the cosmic order, a rebellion in heaven that contaminated the earth so thoroughly that God resolved to destroy it. The originals don't whisper this, they shout it. And if you know where to look in the Septuagint manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Enoch, the Genesis Apocryphon, the Book of Giants, the writings of the earliest church fathers, the full picture emerges with startling clarity. Whether you believe this describes literal events or ancient mythology encoded in sacred literature, one thing is undeniable. The people who wrote these texts, the people who first read them, And the people who preserved them for centuries understood Genesis 6 as describing something far more dramatic, far more cosmic, and far more terrifying than what most modern translations allow you to see. The original text says something terrifying. That's not in question. What is worth asking is why, for centuries, so many people worked so hard to make sure you wouldn't notice. And that's what they wanted buried. But here's what makes this even more significant. Because while certain interpretations were being suppressed in Christianity, an entirely different gospel that was so radical and dangerous to institutional power, they tried everything to hide it. But in their attempt to control the narrative, they accidentally left the evidence scattered across history. Watch that video now, because this connects to everything you just learned in ways that will completely shift how you read Scripture.